Friends, today's lecture is on protection of minority under the UN Charter. Introduction. In the contemporary world, many states have minorities within their borders. Estimates by the United Nations suggest that between 600 million and 1.2 billion people are in need of special measures for the protection of their rights, given that these minorities are often among the most disadvantaged groups in society. However, it is worth noting that protection of the minorities was accorded prominence to international and regional bodies, including the United Nations, only from the early 1980s. This lecture examines why the UN Charter is silent on the word minority, and more specifically, why no specific clauses are put forth in the Charter for the protection of the minorities. In doing so, the lecture traces the historical trend for the protection of the minorities before as well as after the establishment of the United Nations organization. Further, the lecture also examines the chapters and articles in the UN Charter which subsumes the protection of the minority rights in the general protection of human rights. Protection of minorities historical trend. According to Will Kimlicka, minority rights are often distinguished from anti-discrimination policies as two distinct but complementary tools for protecting minorities from injustice at the hands of the dominant groups. Minority rights involve positive group-specific measures, not just non-discriminatory enforcement of universal individual rights. Such minority rights may take the form of language rights, land claims, religious exemptions, guaranteed representation in legislative or advisory bodies, and various forms of territorial or cultural autonomy. The long-standing view before the early 1990s, as far as the minorities are concerned, was that states should have a relatively free rein to manage ethnic diversity or minorities as they see fit. Disaffected minorities have been a source of conflict since the mid-19th century, and the struggles for secessionists and irredentist minorities have repeatedly redrawn the map of Europe, often in violent and destabilizing ways. Woodrow Wilson in 1919 said, "Nothing I venture to say is more likely to disturb the peace of the world than the treatment which might in certain circumstances be meted out to minorities." The First World War 1914 to 1918 led to far-reaching border changes in Europe. As a consequence, a series of new minorities was created. As the Habsburg, Russian, Ottoman multinational empires in Europe broke apart into several new independent countries, the minority problem focused on those people who ended up on the wrong side of new international border. Examples include ethnic Hungarians who found themselves in Romania, or the ethnic Germans who found themselves living in Poland. In order to make sure that these minorities were treated properly and to avoid the creation of new national conflicts, several states had to assume obligations for the protection of these minorities. Further, bilateral treaties were established to ensure reciprocal protection of co-nationals in neighboring countries. For example, Germany agreed to accord certain rights and privileges to ethnic Poles residing within its border, so long as Poland provided reciprocal rights to ethnic Germans in Poland. This treaty system of minority protection was extended and given a more secure international legal basis under the League of Nations, which was founded on 10 January 1920. Thus, the League of Nations was the first multinational organizational mechanism for protecting minorities in modern history of international law and international relations following the World War I. As pointed out by former Secretary General Bhutto Ghali, the League of Nations provided a machinery for international protection of minorities. However, the League was deficient in many ways. The protection it provided was not universal. It applied only in a limited number of states. It lacked a sound international legal foundation, and it contained no unconditional prohibition of discrimination. It also failed to provide for equality before the law for large and small peoples and nations. For one thing, it only protected minorities who had a kin state nearby which took an interest in them. Moreover, the treaties were potentially destabilizing because where such kin states did exist, they could not invoke the treaty to justify invading or intervening in weaker countries. For example, Nazi Germany justified its invasion of Poland and Czechoslovakia on the grounds that these countries were violating the treaty rights of ethnic Germans on their soil. As a result, this approach collapsed in the 1930s, and after the World War II, it was decisively rejected. Post-war replacement of minority rights with universal human rights. An alternate approach for the minorities was adopted after the World War II. This new approach was to substitute universal human rights for minority-specific rights. Rather than protecting vulnerable groups directly through special rights by the member of designated groups, minorities would be protected indirectly by guaranteeing basic civic and political rights to all individuals regardless of their group membership. Basic human rights such as freedom of speech, association, and conscience, while attributed to individuals, are exercised in community with others, and so provide protection for a minority's group life. Where these individual human rights are firmly protected, it was felt no further minority-specific rights are needed. Ines Claude observed, the general tendency of the post-war movements for the promotion of human rights has been forward as a substitute for the concept of minority rights, with the strong implication that minorities whose members enjoy individual equality of treatment cannot legitimately demand facilities for the maintenance of their ethnic particularism. The construction of a system of universal human rights under the UN is one of the great moral achievements of the 20th century, committed to attacking the prejudice and intolerance that have poisoned ethnic relations around the world. But in relation to minority issues, the post-war replacement of targeted minority rights with universal human rights was not only, and perhaps not primarily, the result of moral idealism or a sincere desire to find an alternative means of protecting minorities. It also reflected a desire to control and disempower minorities. UN Charter and the minorities. The Charter of the United Nations is the foundational treaty of the international organization called the United Nations. It was signed at the San Francisco War Memorial and Performing Arts Center in San Francisco, United States on 26 June 1945 by 50 of the 51 original member countries. The Charter codifies the major principles of international relations, from sovereign equality of states to the prohibition of the use of force in international relations. When the United Nations was founded after the Second World War, as noted above, the prevailing view was that special provisions for the rights of the minorities were not needed if individual human rights were properly protected. Thus, the UN Charter does not even mention minorities, although race, sex, language or religion is referred to in the document. For example, Article 1, Clause 3 refers to the development of cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural or humanitarian character and in promoting, encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms of all without distinction as to race, sex, language or religion. This approach, which subsumes the protection of minority rights in the general protection of human rights, is also reflected in the mandates of the main and subsidiary United Nations bodies. The General Assembly, Chapter 4 of the Charter, as stated in Article 10 and 13, may make recommendations to promote the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Article 10 states, the General Assembly may discuss any question or any matter within the scope of the present Charter or relating to the powers and functions of any organ provided for in the present Charter, and except as provided in Article 12, may make recommendations to the members of the United Nations or to the Security Council or to board on any such question or matters. Article 13, Clause 1b states, the General Assembly shall initiate studies and make recommendations for the purpose of promoting international cooperation in the economic, social, cultural, educational and health fields and assisting in the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language or religion. The further responsibilities, functions and powers of the General Assembly with respect to matters mentioned above are set forth in chapters 9 and 10, which deals with international economic and social cooperation. Article 55, Clause C states, with a view to the creation of conditions of stability and well-being which are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations amongst nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, the United Nations shall render respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language or religion. Further, Article 56H, all members pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization for the achievement of the purposes set forth in Article 55. And the responsibility for the discharge of the functions of the organization set forth in this chapter shall be vested in the General Assembly and under the authority of the General Assembly in the Economic and Social Council, which shall have for this purpose the powers set forth in Chapter 9, Article 60. In accordance with the purposes of the United Nations as laid down in Article 1 of the UN Article 76, Clause 3, Chapter 12 of the Charter dealing with the international trusteeship system, seeks to encourage respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language or religion, and to encourage recognition of interdependence of the peoples of the world. And according to Article 76, Clause 4, another objective is to ensure equal treatment in social, economic and commercial matters for all members of the United Nations and their nationals, and also equal treatment for the latter in the administration of justice without prejudice to the attainment of the foregoing objectives and subject to the provision of Article 80. From universal human rights to minority rights. It was understood at the time that human rights approach would not give minorities what they needed to be able to maintain their languages and cultures, such as the right to use their language in public institutions, schools, courts or public media, or to exercise some of local or regional autonomy. Without these minority rights, centuries-old communities and regional culture would be unable to resist the nation building and assimilationist policies of larger state. For some people, the fact that human rights norms did not protect minorities from this long-term assimilationist outcome was a regrettable limitation, but for many others it was in fact an important virtue. The experience of the League of Nations, it was felt, showed that the needs of minorities must be subordinated to the larger interests, in the words of Ines Claude, in making the national state secure and its institutions stable, even at the cost of obliterating minority cultures and imposing homogeneity upon the population. In short, it was raison d'etre as much as moral principle which determined the rejection of pre-war tradition of minority rights. Starting in the 1980s, however, attitudes began to change. According to Will Kimlicka, within the United Nations, these changes have followed two tracks. One for the specific case of indigenous peoples tied to a right to internal self-determination, and another for the minorities in general, grounded primarily in a right to enjoy one's culture. In both tracks, however, there is increasing acceptance of the need for provisions aimed specifically at the needs and aspirations of ethnocultural groups. But some critics see the general movement to promote minority rights as a betrayal of the founding ideals of the international community. In fact, however, both the UN and the Council of Europe are unambiguous that minority rights cannot be used to outweigh the rights of men. The emerging international norms of minority rights are fundamentally liberal democratic in character and are both guided and constrained by a foundational commitment to principles of human rights, individual freedom and equality. Conclusion. The UN's approach to minorities, starting from the Charter, has been to view the problem of the minorities within the understanding of universal human rights and is fundamentally liberal democratic in character. As a result, there was no mention of minorities in the Charter. In the post-war era, the prevailing view was that minority rights were not needed if individual rights were protected. The replacement of the minority rights with universal human rights was not primarily the result of moral idealism or a sincere desire to find an alternative means of protecting minorities. It also reflected a desire to control and disempower minorities. The upsurge of ethnic conflicts involving autonomy-seeking sub-state nationalist minorities in the early 1990s motivated the United Nations to formulate standards regarding minorities, resulting in the 1992 Declaration on Minority Rights.